Welcome back. Well, as the coronavirus moves around the country, it seems the very design of our urban spaces could play an important role in how you are affected by it. So the very defining feature of our country is what geographers might call apartheid spatial geography. The fact that if you are poorer, you live in a township, you have to travel to an urban area where richer people actually live to work. This means Alexandra looks very different to, say, Sandton in Johannesburg. Tembisa looks very different to Boksburg, even though they're both in the same metro of Ekurhuleni. Professor Noor Nieftagodien is from the History Research Group at Wits. He specializes in this. Professor, good afternoon to you. It's fascinating stuff. How does the very shape of our urban geography affect people during a pandemic? It must make a big difference, a massive difference, to your daily life.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. I think this is very important, and what we've all said since the outbreak of the pandemic is that the COVID-19 has amplified all the main privileges in our society, and the geographic privilege that we point to is, of course, one of the fundamental divisions in our society. And by and large, as you've said, poor black people live in poor townships. And it's very interesting, Stephen, it's worth reminding us that, the issues of disease and health have been quite central to the way that spatial segregation and spatial apartheid evolved over more than 100 years. So, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were outbreaks of the bubonic plague, of the pneumonic plague, and in different places like Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Johannesburg, the idea of racial segregation was profoundly influenced by ideas of disease. And in a sentence, the white authorities at that time, saw black people as vectors of disease, as carriers of disease. And in their imagination, urban areas were supposed to be pristine garden cities. In other words, white cities of white power and white privilege in which black bodies that were vectors of disease did not belong. And so at the turn of the 20th century, the locations in which black people lived in the urban areas, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, in Port Elizabeth and elsewhere, were destroyed when there were diseases, and they were moved further away from the city centers. So in the case of Johannesburg, people who lived in a place called what was then called Kuli location were moved to what is today Soweto. These are the origins of Soweto. And so, as you say, over the kind of 100 years since that moment, that founding moment of Soweto, and you can look at any other place across the country, and there's a similar story, black people were moved further away, from the urban areas. And what were the consequences? The consequences, the first one that you've mentioned, which I think is absolutely important, particularly since the discussion on Sunday around, the role of the taxi industry, is that, black people have to travel much further distances from where they live to their workplaces. That is deeply ingrained in the apartheid geography. But it also has amplified and multiplied all the other inequalities. So, for example, if you take Alexandra, again, you can take any township, you have overcrowding, right? You don't have the same facilities in those areas as you have in middle class and white suburban areas. So there's kind of, the point that you're making about how does the pandemic affect, or how does where you live affect the impact of the pandemic on you, these things have been kind of ingrained, embedded into the apartheid geography, into the spatial segregation over more than 100 years.
I mean, in a way, we see that now. And let me give an example, and you can tell me if I've understood this correctly. So people in suburbs might well be complaining tonight because Eskom's moved from stage 1 to stage 2 load shedding. They've got a higher chance of being load shed. But if you've been living in Soweto, where you have a major dispute in some ways with Eskom, you've actually been load shed every day, sometimes for 5, sometimes for 10 hours, for the last 6 months because of the problems there. I mean, this might be an example of this.
Well, exactly, right? And, we have to remember that, poor black areas were traditionally starved of basic services. electricity, proper sewage, water, etc., etc. And so what one has seen in the last 20-odd years, certainly since the advent of democracy, although these processes, precede the advent of democracy, is massive urbanization. And by and large, one of the kind of main problems with the democratic era is that the provision of housing for poor black people has principally taken place in the old apartheid townships or adjacent to those apartheid townships, which means that the pressure on existing services have increased exponentially. And in a context, and you've probably discussed in the last 24 hours, the survey that has just been released about the impact of COVID-19, which shows massive increases in unemployment, particularly of women. So what one has had in these poor black areas is urbanization, congestion, overcrowding of poor people who cannot afford the basic services. And therefore, whatever one's kind of judgment may be about illegal connections, right? The reality is that many people feel they don't have a choice, right? How else will they get electricity? And we've seen the consequences of this in the blackouts in places like Soweto, and the decision by the authorities and Eskom to, in a sense, one could argue, punish people in Soweto for wanting to have access to the electricity grid. And so, yes, people in poor areas have been experiencing, blackouts for much longer than those of us who live in the suburbs.
In so many ways, the suburbs that we have now look really quite similar to how they did 30 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago in some places. I mean, there's been a bit of change in the suburbs. And I know different cities actually have experienced different rates of change. But the township areas, in some cases, are the same. So, and I mean, there are also big differences. I would suggest, just from what I've seen casual observation, Soweto has seen a lot more investment than, say, Alexandra. Let me put all of this another way. You might find some black people moving into the middle class and living in the suburbs. I think you'd struggle to find any white people living in a township.
Absolutely, right. It is, of course, true that the traditional white middle-class suburbs have had, in the last 20 years or so, had an influx of black middle-class people. And, that's understandable. But the poor areas, and you're absolutely right, have remained, by and large, exactly the same as they were in the pre-1994 era. Except, I think, in a number of respects. The first one, which I mentioned already, is that there has been much greater urbanization over the last 25 years that has transformed these spaces into even more congested spaces. If you take investment into the townships, now Soweto is almost an exception. And one must be careful when one talks about Soweto. Soweto may be one contiguous geographical space, but it also comprises many different areas. So the investment in Soweto has not been across the Soweto townships. It has been concentrated in particular areas like Orlando West, parts of Meadowlands, and so on. But the further west you go, right, to Brown Fisherville and further south, Soweto looks very much like it did many years ago, except instead of the apartheid houses, one now has RDP housing complexes. But in a sense, one of the big problems with the RDP housing complexes, notwithstanding that they have provided at least some structure to many people who've not had housing, is that these are poor quality houses. We know of the corruption associated with the provision of RDP houses, and they are not places of social living. They're not places where societies are built. They remain fundamentally what the apartheid townships were. They are dormitory places where people exist, where there is no real opportunity of developing a society, a social cohesion, to use the kind of language that we use today. So in a sense, what we have had, Stephen, over the last 25 years is a kind of enforcement of the apartheid geography, which has deepened inequality. And this is, if you think about inequality as one of the fundamental problems facing our society. And there are many ways of describing that inequality. The geographical separation, the continuation of poor black townships, which continue to suffer from all sorts of social, economic problems, remains a fundamental manifestation of this inequality. And unfortunately, in the way that the democratic era has dealt with this, it will take a long, long time to overcome